say that in other parts, they respond, right? So, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. All right. Welcome to the first of two seminars that are going to be held in Suriname by the Caribbean Development Bank. And we're very grateful that you took time out this morning. All right, so the prevailing economic growth model in the Caribbean, of course, we all know is modeled on the increasing the GDP. And while this may have worked very well for us, we begin to recognize that there are the possibilities of significant and potentially irreversible social, environmental, and economic costs. So, of course, we start thinking about what we can do. And while poverty appears to be increasing, the natural wealth of the planet on the decline. So it is time now for a new paradigm, which is what we're going to be discussing this morning. A new paradigm for Caribbean development transitioning to a green economy. We have three panelists who are going to present to you this morning, and following which you'll be allowed to ask questions after all the presentations are complete. You'll be able to ask questions of the panelists and also engage them in what we expect to have some very strong discussions. We start off first with Dr. Justin Ram. He's the Director of Economics at the Caribbean Development Bank. His specializations are in energy and development economics. He's a Trinidadian by birth. Next we have Mr. Christopher Andrew Mark Brown, and he's in the Business Development Manager of the Development Bank of Jamaica, with several years experience in energy efficiency and energy management. You would have guessed from that he is a Jamaican. Cedric Earl Neal is the Acting General Director of the National Institute for Environment and Development in Suriname. And the institute resides within the Office of the President of the Republic of Suriname as an independent technical coordinating body for environmental matters, as well as a clearinghouse for environment. We'll accept that he's from Suriname, but we know that he's from across the way. So we're going to have the presentations, and like I said, after which you'll be allowed to ask questions. So let's start off first with Dr. Justin Ram. We'll also give you a little bit of a background on the Caribbean Development Bank. Dr. Ram.
Good morning, all. Thank you once more for joining us this morning. As Colin mentioned, this is the first of two seminars that we'll be hosting here in Suriname today. The second one will be on public-private partnerships. So I'm also hoping that many of you will return for that interesting discussion that we'd like to have this afternoon. Both of these seminars are very much related. Today, this morning, we'll be speaking about the green economy, as it were, and how can we transition our traditional economic model, as it were, to one of more greater sustainability into the future. Now, in order for us to do that, we are really looking at the economic, the social, and environmental rates of return on many projects, as it were. We want to ensure that the triple bottom line for the entire economy is positive. Now, we at the Caribbean Development Bank recognize that to transition from the traditional economic model, as it were, to one of a green economy would also require greater involvement of the private sector in the operations of the economy. And so this is why I believe that the seminar that we'll also be holding this afternoon will also be very pertinent to also understand how we can move from a traditional economy to one of a much more sustainable and to provide greater returns for future generations. Now, the Caribbean Development Bank has been in operation for about the last 40 years or so. For those of you who know, our first president was the late Sir Arthur Lewis, who was a Nobel laureate in economics. The Caribbean Development Bank, Suriname became a member of the bank only towards the end of last year. It took many years for Suriname to become a member. And so when Suriname finally joined, we were very pleased about that. It meant that the bank staff acted almost immediately to ensure that the relationship with Suriname would become one that is fruitful and that we as a development bank would actually contribute in a positive way to Suriname's development. So earlier this year, we had a team come into the country and in consultation with many government agencies, including in particular the Ministry of Finance, we crafted a country strategy report for Suriname. This CSP, as it were, country strategy paper, outlines how the Caribbean Development Bank will interact with the government and people of Suriname over the next 4 years. And within that country strategy, we have highlighted some particular areas where we are going to be supporting. Namely, we are likely to provide substantial support for the development of education within Suriname. And how are we likely to do that? We are likely to be investing in building the capacity of the university here. We'll also be investing in TVET centers within the hinterland of Suriname. We saw this as being of a significant priority for Suriname because when we went into the interiors, we found that many of the children within the interior, within the hinterland, were not accessing the same level and quality of education that perhaps children in the coastal areas were. So we saw that as a priority area of development for us. So let me now begin by going through my presentation on the green economy. Today's seminar is really an attempt to publicize one of the major pieces of research which the Caribbean Development Bank undertook earlier this year. And here it is, the green economy transitioning to a new development paradigm. The outline of this presentation this morning, I will go through with you a definition, as it were, as to what do we mean by the green economy. Within this research, we also looked at case studies across the Caribbean. I will give you some examples of what we looked at. I will provide you with some estimates of the cost comparison, because here when we think about the green economy, we're thinking about how we transition from a traditional model of an economy to one of a more sustainable one. And so are there benefits associated with this for economic development, as it were? I will then go into some recommendations, what is required for us to transition to a green economy. And then, of course, provide you with some insights as to what CDB is doing to support the transition to a green economy. So, definition of the term green economy. Like I mentioned earlier, there are three critical elements to this. When we speak about the green economy, we're not only focusing on the first bullet point there, the economic component, where of course we know what that refers to, the obvious transactions that go along within an economy where people engage in consumption and productive activity. What we then also try to do within the green economy is to incorporate the social gains associated with economic activity. And finally, we try to also incorporate the environmental sustainability of development. So that any project that a government or private sector or even civil society is attempting to actually put onto the table, as it were, we need to go through each of these three areas to ensure that that project is sustainable over the long term, as it were. This means to some extent that if you need to compare the economic gains with the social and the environmental gains, you have to now start thinking about how you can actually value the social benefits, how you value the environmental benefits, as it were, and bunch all of those together so that you get a full social rate of return on economic activity before you can make a decision as to whether you should go ahead with a project or not. So the first case study, we looked at the Wigton farms that were developed in Jamaica. This was developed over 3 stages, and in fact it actually utilized to some extent a public-private partnership type of agreement to get this off of the ground. But it actually required, and I'll come to the next slide, it required setting a very good regulatory environment by the government at the time. You're not going to be able to get, for example, renewable energy, such as a wind farm off the ground, if you don't have the correct regulatory environment in place. So from this case study, and I'm just going to summarize very quickly here, what was very important for this? An appropriate policy and regulatory framework to guide the development of the industry. I cannot emphasize again how important that is. Appropriate pricing policy to incentivize the policy, to incentivize the investment. You're not going to get the level of private sector involvement that you require unless they know that they can receive a fair rate of return on their investment. So as regulators, as policymakers, you need to be cognizant of that as well. So here, if you're trying to encourage the private sector involvement within, for example, the production of electricity, here in the case of a wind farm, the pricing policy needs to be fair to ensure that the private sector can receive a fair rate of return, and also that the final end users feel that this is value for money for them as well. Now, as time goes on, you will find that things change. Take, for example, what's going on in world energy markets today. We see that with the introduction of the fracking technology in the US, that's leading to a significant decline in the price of natural gas, certainly in North America. And if, as you might expect, energy markets around the world to converge over time, then the cost of natural gas is likely to come down across the world. What impact is that likely to have on your development of renewable energy? As things change, your regulatory environment needs to be able to adapt to these changes to ensure that the investment is maintained over time. Okay? And finally here, I just want to re-emphasize that it's very important that if you are attempting to get into renewable energy, you need to have the requisite resources as it were. Access to perhaps concessional financing is quite important, as well as having the correct people trained within these areas is very important. So that, for example, to get some of these things off of the ground, you're going to need to have access to cheap money, as it were. And here is where the multilateral and investment and development banks can actually play a role. And we at the Caribbean Development Bank are certainly hopeful that we can support that drive and initiative here within Suriname. Now, a second case study, we looked at the Sandals La Top Resort in Saint Lucia. It's a very beautiful scene there, as it were, from Sandals. It makes you want to be there every day. But what it was that Sandals realized as an organization that with the high cost of energy in many of the Eastern Caribbean countries, could they encourage greater sustainability within their operations, and would this actually lead to financial benefits for them as well? When we looked at this case study, it was quite obvious that yes, there were financial rewards for Sandals associated with becoming much more sustainable. And what did that mean? That meant actually now installing greater energy efficient appliances within the resort, such as more energy efficient air conditioned units, as well as lighting, for example. So the idea here was for Sandals to try to reduce its energy costs over its operations. Sustainability here, of course, also means that they would try, where possible, to use less of the other types of resources, here in particular water. So there are various initiatives that they would have undertaken to ensure that they use less water. As you know, whenever you go to a hotel now, many hotels ask you to perhaps not request that you change your towels every day, because that allows them to use less resources, and then again, that allows them to lower their overall cost of operations. Now, as a consumer, you would hope that that would also feed through as a benefit to you as a consumer. And this is perhaps one sticking point we need to look at. So, what were the key lessons learned from this case study? Again, what we found that there was a desire, there's certainly a need for an appropriate policy and regulatory framework. You're not going to get this sustainability or this greening of the economy without that first point there. Now, with tourism being a major component of many of our economies, and from what I have been studying here in Suriname, that's likely to also be the case over time, as you encourage more tourists to come to Suriname to engage in perhaps ecotourism. We find that the tourism industry needs to come on board, as it were, to understand the benefits associated with RE, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. So perhaps there needs to be some policy formulation around the tourism industry to encourage greater sustainability there. Tourism, energy, and waste management policy for environmental sustainability. Again, the overall regulatory environment was quite important. And this final point here, Sandals is quite a profitable enterprise, and so they have access to finance to allow them to replace their old stock of perhaps air conditioned units and other types of appliances with new forms of cleaner, energy efficient types of appliances. But they were able to do that because they had access to financing internally. Some hotels within the Caribbean, perhaps in Suriname here, may not have the internal access to that financing. And so we need to think about how we can actually have lines of credit that allow hotels to act cheap money to allow them to become much more energy efficient over the long term. Because when you do the math and you do the financial analysis, there needs to be a shorter payback period as possible. Because remember that if you're going from conventional types of appliances to more energy efficient, those are likely to be much more expensive. And so yes, while you might reduce your overall cost of energy from year to year, you need to be able to recover that additional capital cost, as it were. And so if you don't have access to cheap financing, that could be a real deterrent to you doing that. And then finally, we looked at Williams Industries within Barbados, which produces photovoltaic cells to harness solar energy, as it were. Again, what were some of the conclusions coming out of that case study? Again, top of the list here was having a stable policy regime across here, and this one is quite useful, across political administrations. So what you don't want is to have one government saying that this is what they will do, this is the policy. But as soon as an election happens and perhaps there's a change in regime, there's a change in mindset and a change in direction. That if you have that, then it's going to be detrimental to transitioning to a green economy, as it were. There needs to be some uniformity across political regimes. So therefore there needs to be overall buy-in, not only by the government of the day, but also across the political divide. Opposition parties need to also buy into this as well. Fiscal incentives are quite useful. Again, because there needs to be payback periods, perhaps there needs to be tax credits associated with the installation of solar energy panels, for example. Once more, the human resource development was very critical, and without the right skills for negotiations, without the right skills at the technical level, you're not going to get this transition into alternative energy. But let me just jump to these cost comparisons, as it were. Here we looked at traditional forms of generating electricity, as it were. We looked at the levelized cost of electricity for different types of energy producing technologies, going from oil, as it were, to the left, all the way down to hydro on the right-hand side. And we broke these down into the fuel, operations and maintenance, and the capital components of it. Here you can see that oil combustion turbine has the highest levelized cost as a group. And here, hydro has its. Now, in that first couple of slides that I put up, I indicated to you that when you're engaging in making sustainable development decisions, you need to also include not only the financial aspects, the economic aspects of your decision making, you need to look at the social and environmental values as well. And the next slide will show you what happens when you start to include some of those values within your calculation and within your decision matrix. Now, when we start to look at the overall costs, for example, of utilizing these different types of electricity producing technologies, and here we also include the effects of climate change from your options, as well as the negative impacts associated with local air pollution, you find that the localized costs for many of these options increase and go beyond the minimum tariff, as it were, within Jamaica, as it were. So here we can see that we have the minimum tariff here, and it is only the second column there, the oil combustion turbine, which is actually up to that point. Up until then, we find that all other options, as it were, for generating electricity are well within that minimum tariff, as it were. But when we start to include some of the other environmental and social costs, we find that many more of these options are not actually good value for money. And so now, instead of only cancelling out oil combustion turbine as an unviable solution, we find that oil stream is also not looking very good. We're also finding that petroleum and coke is subcritical, is not also economically or financially viable. And some of the other options as well, we can see, are not making sense, as it were, from a sustainability point of view. Again, here, what's very useful is that the renewable energy technologies are performing quite well. So, in a nutshell, what this is telling us is that sometimes renewable energy initially looks as if it might not be viable, as it were. But for policy making from a social context, from a societal point of view, we need to start looking at all of the various costs associated with each technology if we are to make proper decisions for the long-term sustainability of our economies. So what were some of the selected recommendations coming out of the research? I'm probably not going to read through all of this, but again, what we found that it's very important for us to have a stable policy environment for us to encourage the use of renewable energy, strengthen the intersectoral linkages of renewable development in the context of regional and national sustainable development. Now, I should say that we are likely to get to a more sustainable economy within the Caribbean region, and here I'm talking about from Suriname all the way up to Bahamas in the north and over to Belize in the west, as it were. If we were to operate more at a regional level, could you imagine if we had regional electricity grids, as it were? Some countries, like for example Suriname, that can actually produce electricity using hydro, as it were, a very clean form of energy, but clean in the sense of not much of an impact on the global environment. There might be localized impacts associated with hydro, of course, which I'm certainly aware of. But if you are able now to sell your electricity to other countries, to Guyana, to Trinidad and Tobago, and then up to other small islands within the Eastern Caribbean, then you're able to actually have greater economies of scale, as it were, and it becomes much more of a financially viable enterprise for you to do that. And in fact, we're seeing that happening within some of the Eastern Caribbean countries, where they are interested in developing their geothermal resources to produce electricity. It doesn't make sense for them to develop that geothermal capacity if they are only developing it to produce electricity for themselves. So, for example, a small island like Dominica. But what they have found that if they can export that electricity to some of their neighboring countries, in particularly here, the French territories of Martinique and Guadeloupe, then it becomes a much more financially viable enterprise. And so that then encourages private sector involvement as well. Okay. So here are some of the other selected recommendations from the report, and I'll be quite happy to answer some questions about these later on, but I just want to wrap up with this last slide. So how can the Caribbean Development Bank assist in this? Well, we now have a renewable energy unit within the bank, and we are now developing our new energy policy as it were, with a great emphasis on renewable energy and energy efficiency. We are likely now to also provide policy-based support. So we are providing support to governments in the form of loans, as it were, so that they can get the policy environment right. Yes, because we think that that's vitally important. That is the first piece in this puzzle. If we get that piece correct, then we can then have a transition to more green technologies. We'll also be providing technical assistance so that you can access grant resources from the Caribbean Development Bank if you need to have, for example, assessments done to see further the viability of your projects that you're thinking of engaging with. And of course, we're a development bank, so we can provide concessional resources for the use of renewable energy and EE, energy efficiency development. And I should say here that we have just established a public-private partnership unit within the bank. And we're actually hiring a coordinator. That person should start with the Caribbean Development Bank as early as 1st of December. And this unit is meant to help countries develop their PPP initiatives, as it were. We think that there are probably not sufficient PPP projects in each country to warrant the establishment of a unit in all of our countries. So what we're attempting to do is to now pool this, as it were, with the Caribbean Development Bank, providing that regional support for countries to allow them to engage the private sector in various types of infrastructure development. And here we see the use of renewable energy and perhaps energy efficiency as being one route where PPPs can be used in a substantial way, as it were. And again, I'm happy to take questions from you later on. So that brings me to the end, finally, to the presentation. I'm happy to answer questions after the two other presenters have presented.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Christopher Brown from the Development Bank of Jamaica. And first, I want to thank CDB for giving me the opportunity to share my experience in the private sector, investments in private sector and energy in Jamaica. I came here early Sunday morning, and I haven't been given a chance to experience Suriname, but if there's anybody who wants to chaperone me tonight, I'm Alright, so just a little about the Development Bank of Jamaica. We are wholesale lenders, so most of our funding goes through commercial banks, intermediary financial institutions, and gets to the private sector. We primarily focus on commercial activity. For energy specifically, and I'll touch on it briefly, we have a specific residential component. The bank is not only into lending, but also capacity building, as well as we have a PPP, public-private partnership unit as well. So we try and support economic activity within the country. So, like most countries in CARICOM, Jamaica is heavily dependent on importation of fuel. And unfortunately, we have the highest energy prices in the Latin American and Caribbean region at around 42 US cents per kilowatt hour. The issue is that industrial sectors find it very difficult to become competitive, and especially in this global market that we are all participating in. This is something that needs to be considered. So, due to the high cost of energy, private sector growth has been stifled. A number of organizations have been forced to shut down, as well as a lot struggle not knowing how to find the solution. So, as a national directive, the Development Bank of Jamaica stepped in. In 2009, we established an energy fund for SMEs. It started off very slowly, as you can see. By about 2012, we started to see the uptake increase, and this was primarily due to the fact that we conducted a demand study on the economy, trying to understand what the reasons are why people have not invested. We also created a structure to train energy auditors to ensure that there are professionals that can support the private sector investment. And in 2013, we saw it increase to about 6.5 million. This was coming from 1.7 million in the previous year, and as low as 700,000 in 2010. And by 2014, we maintained that 6 million approval threshold. The total portfolio that we have for energy loans now stands at over 2 billion US. And that is a great achievement in our mind, especially starting from struggling to reach $1 million each year. We have been able to foster a lot of investments by the private sector within this area. Our overall objective is to reduce oil imports into Jamaica. The situation in Suriname may be a bit different, but what I want to show is a country that has faced a number of challenges, how we have been able to foster this type of investment by the private sector. So our main objective is to reduce the oil imports into Jamaica, and these are a number of areas that we participate in. On the bauxite alumina, which is large industrial, will provide energy efficient equipment and renewable energy. As it relates to electricity supply, we facilitate the development of new construction and improve generation technology. I know Justin spoke about it earlier, that it's something that CEB will support in terms of credit and technical support as well. And on the demand side, we provide energy efficiency and renewable energy support for the private sector. I would say private sector and public sector to some extent, which I'll speak to a little more later in the presentation. And our only involvement on the residential side is in energy. We have recently created a new energy line for residential entities to borrow so that they can invest. The bank has three main pillars for energy. The first being that to attract funding, and this could either be loans or for technical assistance programs. The second being financing solutions, so to try and create the appropriate financing solutions to support the market. We ensure that there are key partnerships within the financial institutions that we utilize to get to the market. And then thirdly, technical assistance and capacity building. So we understand that after providing the financing, guidance on how to use the financing is very key. The bank utilizes an ecosystem approach. As you can see, it consists of energy audits, public education, energy management, and creating financial mechanisms. So I'll start with the first one, energy auditing. So we have assisted universities to establish a certified energy manager training program, which ensures that auditors meet minimum standards. These auditors are those who will come into an institution and assess what is required to reduce the cost of energy, provide recommendations as to what this total investment will cost, and an analysis to indicate what the payback will be. So it gives a clear vision on what the operations or the SME will have to invest so that they can make a good decision. The second I want to talk about is public education. So we have developed a number of demonstration projects, which I'll give 2 examples further on. We feel like it's, and it's something that we learned after a while, that having strong marketing presence is important for the country to know that funding is available for these type of investments, as well as for the country to understand what type of benefits are in making these investments. And to support putting funding into the market, capacity building support is necessary. So the private sector needs to understand what their role is to be. The financial institutions need to understand what their role is to be as well as the suppliers of the various equipment. One of the key issues we have realized is that the people who are supplying, whether it's solar panels, energy efficient air conditioning units, renewable energy or energy efficiency technologies, they find it difficult to explain to the bank, or to speak in terms of the bank. They speak a more technical language than what the banks are interested in. So a number of our capacity building issues are aimed at creating the bridge between the 2 professions. Energy management is something that is also key. It's often left out. It's really trying to ensure that after a project is designed and implemented, that it is sustained. There are a number of standards. There's an ISO 50001 standard. There are New Zealand standards. There are a number of energy management standards which each project, I believe every project should have as a component. So at first you do your energy auditing, which is to analyze what exists. After you implement the project, you also need to have energy management, which ensures it's sustainable over the period of time. Without utilizing this energy management framework, a project that started out with a 3-year payback may extend to 5 years or 7 years. So it's something that needs to be included in the design of the program. And I would say the final piece after all these 3 have been created is that for the financing mechanism. So the bank currently provides attractive loan funding to the private sector. It's supported by collateral guarantees, and it's also supported by grants. The initial aspect of doing energy audits are supported by grant funding from the bank. Justin made mention of it earlier that CDB would support the Suriname government in providing grants for pre-feasibility studies and so forth, which is what energy audits are. Our DVJ Energy Fund has funded over 10 million US energy projects in energy efficiency and renewable energy. We currently have interest rates of 8%, and this is in $. And we have a loan tenure of up to 10 years. Our collateral guarantee covers actually up to 80% of the loan amount, or a maximum of 100,000 US. So if a private sector entity wanted to borrow, let me use US. If a private sector wanted to borrow 200,000 US dollars to implement a program, we would support up to 100,000 in collateral guarantee and therefore they would need to find another 100,000 as collateral, whether that is land, cash, and I'm not sure the environment here, but the equipment itself that is purchased, I think is something that should be considered to be used as collateral. We did some demonstration projects. We did 7 of them in 4 different areas: agriculture, tourism, services, and agro-processing. And I'll give you some examples of the results for 2 of them. So the first was a hotel. They invested in energy efficiency and renewable energy in technologies, air conditioning units, solar water heating system, solar PV systems as well. The actual investment was about 50,000 US, and they've been able to see savings of 15,000 US annually. So that's a payback period of about 3-4 years, let's call it. And this, based on our work in the area, is standard. On average, energy efficiency projects mixed with renewable energy projects pay back for themselves within 4 or 5 years. Another example is that of an agro-processing facility. This is a facility that deals with pork products, sausages, bacons, etc. And we assisted them to change their rate structure, so they were able to pay less to the utility than they were previously paying. Air conditioning units did maintenance on the boiler at an overall cost of 20,000 US, and they have been able to see annual savings of 50,000 US. So that's a project that has paid back for itself within a year. This is probably the diamond in the rough, but I think it's a good example to show that it is something that is possible. That was me giving some ideas of how the private sector can invest in energy efficiency and reap benefits. I want to touch briefly on how the public sector can also benefit through private sector investment. Justin made mention earlier about PPPs, public-private partnerships. I think it's a very useful model when trying to when trying to demonstrate the effects to the public. It's good to start with government agencies. I think the public will respond positively. I don't think it's something that needs to be a precursor. The private sector will invest themselves, because ultimately they're trying to maintain competitiveness and increase their own profits. But what we're doing within the public sector is creating a structure to support the development of an ESCO industry, which are energy service companies. So they are energy suppliers presently selling solar systems or selling air conditioning units. And after it is sold, then their job is done. The ESCO goes a bit further. So it's one, I would say the difference is one, they'll be interested in financing the project themselves. And 2, the operation and maintenance of the project is something that they will also take on. It would be over a longer period of time, maybe a 7-10 year contract. But the benefits to the public sector is that it doesn't have to take on that type of risk or consider investing its own funds within its agencies. So the vehicle we're proposing is that of a public-private partnership, and the target could be schools, hospitals, ministries, any other public building that exists. Some key activities being done and which should be considered for this ESCO industry is creating the legislative and regulatory framework, understanding how the ESCO will get paid over a period of time, what obligations need to be done by the public sector entity during the life of the contract. Building the capacity of the ESCO themselves. We have done a number of workshops as I said, trying to build the gap between those that have the technical knowledge and those that have the financial knowledge. Strengthening the financial institutions themselves to understand how to analyze projects. I would say, done a number of workshops with financial institutions in understanding how to analyze projects and seeing the benefits of energy efficiency projects. And we are currently looking at creating a specific loan product for ESCOs. The idea is, let's say, lower interest rates supported by guarantees over a longer period of time. An example of the relationships between the government and the private sector, and demonstrate, indicating what some of the benefits would be. So the government should provide or can consider providing some form of assets for the investment. So whether it is the land or the building for the public sector agency. It may also make small investments, for example, fixing the windows and the actual building envelope. The private sector would not want to invest, let's say, air conditioning units in a room that has broken windows. So it may be those small investments could be contribution of the public sector. And the public sector could also, or I should say the government, could also consider providing guarantees for this type of investment. The private entity would then make investments in the high capital cost technology, whether that's your renewable energy, your hydro, your solar, or even air conditioning units on a large scale, lighting as well. And they would make the investment in the operations and maintenance. So it is in their benefit to maintain the project over a period of time, because the savings that are generated by the public sector is how they will recover their investment. And they, in essence, are the owners of the project. The public sector or the government is not, I would say, it should focus on public activity and allow the private sector to focus on their private operations. We have seen in Jamaica that the private sector will operate a lot of things more efficiently because they're trying to make profits. That's their ultimate aim. The public entity's aim is more to facilitate public joy, let's say. So these two things come into an energy project, and the benefits on the other end is that the government realizes savings and it reduces its investment. The risk in making the investment. The private entity, they reap the benefits as in profits from the investment, and they're also able to develop a track record in implementing these sort of projects. Depending on how many of these energy projects are done locally, the banks may not feel comfortable lending to these type of projects. So it's something that over time, if you allow the private sector to invest in a number of different projects, they'll be able to access finance easier to implement more projects. So, just to close, some lessons we have learned are that a national energy efficiency policy or an energy efficiency law is key. It fosters the development of these type of programs. I'll give an example. In Japan, they have an energy efficiency law which indicates any private entity that uses over a certain amount of kilowatt hours, over a certain amount of energy, needs to hire an energy manager. So that person, by law, is mandated to be employed to the organization to manage their energy use. Energy projects should include energy efficiency and not just renewable energy. And again, this is in the context of Jamaica. Something that you should consider for your local industry is what fits best. But the best practice is that renewable energy is not something that should be done by itself. Energy efficiency is also something that should couple it. An example of that is when we just started doing energy projects in Jamaica, we looked at an agriculture, a poultry farm, trying to understand if we could help them to invest in solar energy. And the initial cost was about 500,000 US. We did an energy audit, and the audit indicated that if they did energy efficiency first, the renewable energy component would cost about 150,000. So it's a drastic reduction implementing renewable energy after you have implemented energy efficiency. So the overall project cost after the audit came down to about 200,000 US, starting at 500,000. So it's something that as best practice should be considered.
I will be speaking to something differently than the previous two speakers, but certainly within the context of what we're talking about today, which is sustainable development. Perhaps for most of, or many of you, you are aware that as of last year, 2013, a project was approved by the World Bank with respect to sustainable forest management, simply called the Readiness Preparation Proposal on RED+. What RED+ means, you'll see it in a minute. The content of my presentation, briefly discussing the concept of green energy, green economy, RED+ and Suriname, the way we're looking at sustainable development as a country, especially the organization that I work for, and RED+ as a tool for sustainable development in Suriname. Prior to 2012, the Rio Conference, the United Nations Division on Sustainable Development, UNEP, which is the United Nations Environment Program, as well as the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, published a report on green economy. And just wanted to share briefly with you 3 statements that were made within this report. First one is our thoughts about that there's not one definition for green economy, but that economy should also contribute to sustainability of a country. Very striking also was the issue of getting the economy right. The way the economy is going right now is that I guess we're looking only at profits, not looking at sustainability of even the economic activity that we're doing. So in that sense, looking at how economics is contributing to sustainability. And what definitely should be said is that economic activities and environment go hand in hand, which means that they're complementary to each other, and that's how we should look at sustainability. Within our concept of sustainability, we looked at some facts when it comes to Suriname. Suriname is a forest-rich country, actually the greenest country in the world. I'll speak to that later on. We have enormous potential when it comes to natural resources extraction or management thereof, especially water resources, for potable drinking water, or even for the hydro projects we were talking to just a bit. We know that the forest is also home to, communities that have been there for centuries and have been actually living very closely with the nature. We also know that, our forest is home to enormous sorts of species. This was taken in one of our mountains in the western part of the country. We also know that urbanization is something that, if you look at the trend currently, the district of Huanica, which is becoming very populated. So there's a trend, urbanization trend. Our urbanization is increasing in Suriname. We also know that, we are all also making use of the natural resources that we have as a country. So in this content, we have to look at, sustainability when we're talking about Suriname. Suriname is a country in development, and we should recognize that. But there's a problem with definitions, certainly. A country covered with 94.7% forest has a deforestation rate of 0.02% annually. And what we would like to do is to realize development for the Surinamese in the years to come. But how should this development be realized? We're a forested, rich country. We have a deforestation rate of 0.02%. So how should this development be realized? We strongly feel that the RED Plus concept, and RED Plus stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, and the plus, well, that stands for actually forest management. So what we would like to do is to have sustainable forest management in Suriname. That's how we want to realize our development. The traditional model of RED Plus is that we decrease emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and in return, financial compensation. So you try to develop your economic activity in such a way that it doesn't increase emissions to the environment, but in return get then financial compensation. That's the traditional model. The model we are looking at in Suriname is we want to use this as a planning mechanism in order to decrease growth in deforestation, to support meeting the economic development goals in general, and specifically for the following. Certainly we want to increase the GDP, and yes, every country wants to increase the GDP. We want to have the infrastructural works that we were talking about. We want to do the mining, especially when it comes to gold mining. We still want to do forestry. We still want to be one of the major suppliers of food to the Caribbean. Yes, we want to have everything, but we want to do it sustainably. So that's the concept that we want to use. So that's not the traditional concept of decreasing the emissions and getting paid therefore, but we want to use this as a model where we can still do the economic activities, but sustainably. Briefly, the cost of the project that was approved by the World Bank, you see here, total budget of 16.1 million US. Actually, that's increased to 22 when we did some revisions to the project. But what it looks like, we would like to have some institutional capacity where we want to develop a Red Plus strategy and do, in that regard, a lot of technical work, a lot of research. The characteristics of Red Plus in Suriname, that's based on sustainable development, and I'll talk to what we see as sustainable development in a little bit. Inclusiveness, we want to involve those that have not been involved before in development, especially when it comes to the private and civil society, private sector and civil society. We want to increase their involvement into this development concept. Participative, in the sense that we will like to increase awareness and education in order for those that need to participate can participate. It definitely will be a natural approach. Benefit sharing, especially when it comes to the indigenous and maroon communities. They need to benefit from this development. And certainly, the other characteristic, last but not least, is that we want to gather the data relevant to make policy. So research will be one of our major components when it comes to the implementation of our Red Plus program in Suriname. So how do we look at sustainable development, the concept itself? I guess this is known to most of you. Concept which was developed by the World Commission on Environment and Development in 1987. Just to elaborate a little bit more on the outcome document in Rio, when they talk about especially public participation, access to information is very important. Access to judicial and administrative proceedings is very critical when we talk about sustainable development. And we're thinking that with this program that we want to implement, that we will definitely put those mechanisms in place for the public to participate. Governance. Besides the central government in Suriname, there's also local governments. There's also traditional authorities that have some say into, how we develop this country sustainably. We think that with the implementation of the program also, we will have these mechanisms in place. So what are these mechanisms? First, we know that sustainable development has 3 dimensions. And I think Justin spoke to this earlier also. Social, economic, and environment. And when it comes to Red Plus in Suriname, when we talk about the social part of this program and the governance structure that needs to be in place, we would like to involve what is called the 9 major groups in Suriname. These are groups besides the central government that take part into daily activities in Suriname or are key to development issues in Suriname. And we have established certain institutions, Red Plus Steering Committee, which they will take part in, the Major Groups Collective, and new and also very innovative for Suriname is the Red Plus system, which are representative of the 10 tribes in Suriname. They are appointed by the 10 tribes and they will participate in this program as well. We're also looking at the mechanism of FPIC, Fee Prior Informed Consent, or consultation protocol. And we're also looking at a grievance and redress mechanism, because when you want to develop, especially the interior, there will be some grievance, there will be some redress necessary in that aspect. Economic. Like I said, we want to have the economic activities that we have planned. We want to increase our GDP. And like I said, one of the key issues involving indigenous and rural communities, and also others as well, even the private sector, is a benefit sharing mechanism that we want to put in place. Lastly, the environment. One of the issues we think that definitely will come out as one of the results of this particular program is that of sustainable forest management. And it's not only looking at forestry, but also looking at other segments of that sector as well. Nature conservation. And one of the issues that is very dear to the organization that I work for is environmental and social assessments. If we want to carry out big scale or large scale projects, definitely environmental and social impact assessments are necessary. With that, just a brief recap. I've presented to you the concept of green economy as the UN organizations see it. Certainly, one of the things we're saying here in Suriname, yes, there's no one definition for green economy, but certainly, if you look at our circumstances and you look at our reality, we as a country would like to develop a Red Plus program, which in our context is appropriate for the country. Lastly, looked at Red Plus as a tool for sustainable development in Suriname, looking at the three components of sustainable development, and within that you see that that program does contribute to the three components or three dimensions of sustainable development: social, economic, and environmental. With that, I thank you.